Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots and give you a big picture for business in Africa. I'm Arnold, Segawa. On the agenda today, we ask a panel of analysts and experts why governments are making such heavy weather of deregulating airline travel. 20 years after recognizing liberalizing African air travel would spark an employment bonanza and spur economic growth across the continent. We remain in the departure lounge, though. In the commodities corner, sugar is on track for record global production levels this year, but will an increasingly unstable global economy leave a bitter taste for the commodities prospects? First, we cross to our Kigali bureau for today's business headlines.
Now, here in Kigali, barely a month ago, looking at the East African region, Ethiopia's privatization process just happened a few months ago. But now we saw the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed also making a historic visit to Asmara in Eritrea in a bid to amend the relationship between the two nations after more than 20 years of war and desolations. Now, also in Uganda, Ugandans have dragged government to court to withdraw the social media tax, which came into effect a few days ago. Now, the move is part of the government's bid to expand its tax base. The petitioners want courts to declare the controversial tax as illegal, null and void. They also claim that the introduction of the tax contravenes and is inconsistent with national interests and common good of online promotion.
Many thanks for that, Maggie. I just want to follow up on that story coming out of Ethiopia. Historic visit, of course. We do know Prime Minister Abiy. He's only 42 years, taking over from Haile Mariam there. But the question has to be, what does he actually bring to the table? He is relatively younger, but is privatization and liberalization and opening up the way to go for Ethiopia?
The two countries accepted to open their skies. Ethiopian Airlines will begin to fly into Eritrea, but also we know Eritrea has an airlines which will fly into Ethiopia. But most importantly for Ethiopia, there is accessibility to the ports. The Prime Minister, rather the President in Eritrea says, there is free access to the ports. Up until now, we know that Ethiopia has been landlocked, but also they have been relying on Djibouti, on Sudan, and also moving as far as of Kenya, to be able to transport their goods. They don't have any access to the sea. And they've been investing massively, to build something, in Kenya, in Sudan, to be able to export their commodities. We know there's such a powerhouse in terms of manufacturing. So for the two countries, I think this is such great news in terms of business.
Now, moving from the east of the continent to the west, Nigeria's visit demands appear to be causing some consternation. Our reporter Christy Cole joins us from Lagos. Christy, good to have you on the show. Surely a storm in a teacup. After all, the visa charges are common practice on the continent, wouldn't one argue?
Well, the visa on arrival policy in itself is not something new in Nigeria. It's actually been on for over some 2 years now. The crux of the matter at this point for the country's immigration services is the fact that it did introduce the biometrics and processing fee to the tune of $110 without appropriate publicity. And this, of course, threw the entire immigration system into chaos on June the 12th when the policy was introduced. Visitors who arrive in Nigeria wait in line to obtain visa on arrival from the airport immigration. The visa on arrival policy, which according to the immigration has been operative in the country for 2 years, has recently run into controversy over charges of a $90 procurement fees and $20 processing fees from foreign travelers. There are reports of some visitors losing monies in the process, as well as confusion due to poor communication. Other reports claimed that the policy had been suspended due to these discrepancies, all of which the immigration are now aware. In an exclusive chat with CNBC Africa, spokesperson of the Nigeria Immigration Service, Sunday James, maintains that the visa on arrival program has not been suspended. He says charges from the policy are merely reciprocal and in line with global best practices.
The fee for each and every country is commensurate to what is being paid by Nigerians. So it's reciprocal. And for this one too, individuals have been saying that the federal government of Nigeria suspended visa on arrival. Is not true. It was just that money that the CGI directed that they should suspend the payment for now for that specific $90 until it's integrated and there's clearance on certain procedures that need to be followed.
We're trying to attract people to our country. We want to have a visa regime that makes it easy at a reasonable cost. I don't think the reciprocity is a very good principle for the way we do the visa system.
This is very fascinating because on one end across the border we're seeing Ghana opening up, letting all Africans in, having this very pan-African sort of mentality. Rwanda also, we just came from there, and Rwanda is also doing the same. Just give me a sense of your views from at least, well, what economists are saying and also the private sector regarding this particular stature.
It's a two-way conversation, actually, from the economists we have. Break down all communication barrier, break down all trade barriers, throw the borders open, let investors come in, let tourists come in. Let's see if we can get more money to boost the GDP of the country in that regard. But there's also talks about security. And for the immigration, especially, their point is that this is a principle based on reciprocity. Now, if you ask the economists, they say to you, if you want to base such a matter on the principle of reciprocity, should you not ask yourself the question as a country of what do you stand to gain? Who needs more, the visiting countries or the countries being visited? So for Nigeria's immigration services especially, all they say is it is part of it is a step in the right direction for the journey towards ease of doing business, rather, which is what the country is trying to promote. But they do accept that communication was poor. To this effect, what they did was to, as soon as the issue became a point of controversy, they halted the process with immediate effect, and it's been halted indefinitely. So what the immigration has said to CNBC Africa exclusively is it will remain indefinite until they are able to sort out this miscommunication issues that turned a policy that was supposed to work in favor of ease of doing business and attracting investors into the country into a situation that the country's immigration system now currently has on its hands.
Christy, just one more very brief question. What are the odds that this visa policies, the madness is happening right now, at least in Nigeria, and we also have Nigeria not willing to sign the Africa Free Trade Area?
Well, at this point, should we say maybe for the first time, the country is taking into cognizance and paying more attention to the fact that it's got to, before signing any contract, whether it is global best practices, it first must consider, call it protectionism to some extent, maybe you will be right, but it must first consider what does Nigeria benefit from such policies, even if it is global best practices. What should Nigeria look to gain, and how does this benefit Nigeria as an economy and its people?
Many thanks to our very own Christy Call there in our Lagos Bureau. Fascinating sum up there. Call it maybe protectionism on one end, but the question remains, what does Nigeria stand to gain? Let's take a short break. More Capital Connection after this. Welcome back to Capital Connection with me, Arnold. Segawa. Now, sugar is produced in 123 countries. World sugar production, on the other hand, is expected to reach 185 million tons in the 2017-2018 year, with consumption rising 174 million tons, both record levels. To discuss the commodity, I'm joined by a senior agriculture economist at Absa Bank. It's Wessel Lemmer.
Good evening, Arnold. Thanks. It's a pleasure.
Tell me, Wessel, how is sugar faring today in the market?
We consume about 80 to 100,000 tons of sugar in a month. So that 700,000 tons must first be utilized by demand in South Africa. But doing so, we need to protect our local industry for additional imports of cane sugar. So the industry talked to President Ramaphosa earlier this year to expedite that process at the International Trade and Administration Commission to get the tariff increased by, it's from $566 a ton to $856 a ton. It seems huge, but it's necessary to bring us just on par with previous levels of cane sugar in 2017. So it will not do anything to the price of sugar. It will just bring us up to that level where our producers can produce profitably and not at a loss, to protect our jobs also in the country.
Now, Wessel, in the past 5 years, we have seen the production, of course, increase. Tell me, what could we actually attribute this increase in the production to?
Well, it's the past 3 or 4 years locally. The production of our sugar increased, the cane increased because of the drought that we had previously, 14 million tons. It was 40 million tons of production. Normal production is 20 million tons. We think we will go to recover with the rainfall to about 19 million tons this year. So that's positive. But then we need to have these supportive prices now. We need to have this import tariff that's now submitted for review, that new reference price level of $856 a ton.
Many thanks for making time to speak to us, Vessels. We'll definitely keep in touch on this particular corner. Welcome back to Capital Connection. I'm Arnold, Segawa, where we connect the dots of what is making news and business sense, not forgetting finance, across the continent. After years of false starts, Africa is creeping closer towards a single free market commercial aviation policy designed to lift punitive and often absurd air travel restrictions. When it is green-lighted, the Open Skies policy, as it is termed, will slash airfares, create tens of thousands of jobs for Africans. That's, of course, for the airlines and businesses, not forgetting give a healthy shot in the arms for other sectors, from the construction industry through to tourism. To discuss the benefits and the clear air turbulence awaiting the introduction of Open Skies, we're now joined by, in our Johannesburg studio, by the CEO of South Africa Airways, Mr. Vuyani Jurana, in Lagos, the associate partner of law firm Aelex, that's Lawrence Fubaranga. And gentlemen, many thanks for making time to speak to us. Let me just start with you. Let's talk about all these commitments, Vuyani. First of all, there's so many commitments that are made, Yamoussoukro, Africa Union, and they do not actually materialize. They just hang somewhere in a cupboard and collect lots of dust. Is this pertinent to this conversation around Open Skies?
So I think it's important to trace the evolution of the single African transport market, if you like. So it starts with the Yamoussoukro decision, and it goes through to different kind of validations up to the point where the decision is made. So what's critical is the fact that there are African countries that are participating in the single African air travel market. That on its own gives us the policy framework within which the commercial delivery can be done. What's important, though, is that policy alone is not good enough. We need commercial arrangements that needs to be established by commercial players, ourselves, airlines across the continent, to actually bring this to life. So policy framework is being enabled. It's an enabling framework, which is a very, very big step towards enabling the movement of Africans in the continent.
Right. Let me just put a pause on that particular one and throw over to Lagos. Lawrence, 44 countries did sign the Yamoussoukro decision, but ratification is almost unheard of. We're talking close to 12 countries. Do we get the sense that there's commitments that are made, but when it comes to actually realizing these commitments, that's where there's stalling, to say the least?
Well, yes. I mean, the Yamoussoukro decision is actually applicable to the entire continent, all Africa, so the decision of heads of state, and it applies to the entire AU. Now, I agree with Mr. Vuyani that it seems as if policy alone cannot do it, and the question is, why not? The other question, of course, is how do you get to that policy? I think part of the problems which we have, as you normally hear, you hear that it's a great policy, but the problem is implementation. If it can't be implemented, then it's not a great policy. So the question then is, how did you come about that policy? And you heard him say commercial arrangements must follow. Some people would argue that, in fact, the commercial arrangements should be in place, and the commercial justification, or bankability, if you want to put it that way, should be in place before policy follows. A lot of times we have regulatory and policy inconsistency. Sometimes you have lack of regulatory clarity. And I dare say sometimes you are not even sure whether indeed we know what we want. And if you
I
don't
like
know
where
what
you're
you
going
want,
with this,
you certainly will
Lawrence.
not get the sort of outcome.
I'm loving where you're going with this, Lawrence, because it's actually fitting into my other question. If 80% of the air traffic on the continent can be attributed to outside airlines in the Middle East, to say, you're talking about bankability, but haven't we auctioned our bankability of air travel on the continent off to the Middle Easterns?
No, I certainly won't point fingers in any particular direction when you say Middle Easterns. If you say international air carriers control our dominant players in the African market, yes. But I will not point a particular finger in any one direction. But the truth, you're right. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the paradox is that up till now, before we started talking about open skies, you had generally bilateral arrangements between sovereign states. Now, that was an offshoot of the development of aviation right from the Second World War. And the so-called freedoms of the air were actually restrictions of the air. They prevented, they gave rules and conditions for you to fly into, to fly out, to pick up passengers in different countries. Now we're hearing the mantra over the last 20 years has been open skies. So open skies for whom? For the very people that for many years closed their borders to others. They strengthened their carriers, they got their business models right, and then now I think Africa is one of the last frontiers, and the argument now is open the skies for everybody to come in. I know that's a bit controversial sometimes, but the truth of the matter is you first of all have to know what you are giving out before you give a carte blanche to third parties to come into your country.
Lawrence, I'm loving where you're going with this. I could see Vuyani here just nodding in agreement. Vuyani, let me bring it back to you. South Africa and Kenya, at the time they signed their agreement in 2000, we did see a 70% rise in traffic, at least for passengers. What is stalling this?
Look, I think one of the key things that's important is to look at the movement of Africans within the continent. When you look at the air travel, it tends to take the old colonial routes that you will connect into. When you go to an adjacent country, neighborhood country, you'd go through a European hub because of this. That's how the investment in air travel infrastructure has been geared. Now there's been the emergence of the Gulf carriers that have created hubs outside the continent. It still makes the travel, the movement of Africans in their continent very, very difficult because you have to go through hubs and you have to wait for many, many more hours to connect back to the same country. I mean, if you are going to go to Abuja today, you have to go elsewhere, then come back outside the continent at times and then go to Abuja. We need to address that. Part of addressing it is to build strong African airlines. And building strong African airlines is not about the single or 3 or 4 big airlines. It's going to about building partnership relationships at the regional level, creating consortia. The open skies policy creates a possibility now to quickly make commercial arrangements without being worried about policy framework that tends to take longer to enable you to execute your business plan.
Vuyani, I love where you're going with that. I've been on a flight to Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, and you leave Kigali, you actually go to Cotonou, you go to Libreville, then you finally arrive in Abidjan. 9 hours. It's actually longer to go to Abidjan than it is to actually go to Belgium. Fascinating indeed.
Absolutely. I think what's critical is that the policy framework now is enabling, which means you can hop within the continent, different cities, not only focusing on city pairs, but then you've got freedom rights to go beyond the city that you would pairing with. Critically important is how we get the right investment with the right gauge of infrastructure, of aircraft to be able to carry traffic in the thin traffic routes. But then it's going to take partnership. For example, how do you partner deeply with players in West Africa so that you can bring the open skies policy into life without sacrificing, without a notion of a winner takes it all. So I think it's a big development. The fact that the policy framework now has been dealt with, it gives us space to actually start to put commercial arrangement to execute on the plan.
Well, Welcome back to Capital Connection, where we connect the dots across the continent for what is making economic news and with all the movers and the shakers. Don't forget, you can be part of the conversation here via Twitter at CNBC Africa. Let's pick up on that particular conversation, open skies and mergers. As before, in Lagos, we're joined by associate partner of a law firm, that's Aelex, Lawrence Fubaranga. And here in the studio, we do have the CEO for South Africa Airways, that's Vuyani Jurana. Many thanks, gentlemen, for staying with me. Mergers. Now, I've come across something very fascinating. 91, Delta Airlines had a partnership with Pan Am, US Airways, 2000 still with American Airways, Western Airlines with Delta. You do get the sense that there's convergence here happening. And on the contrary, we do have a situation in Africa where Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, just East Africa is coming up with all these airlines doing the opposite.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that we have to keep in mind is that by and large, in the African continent, the national carriers still represent a lot of national aspirations. And I think that the opportunities to build consortiums without sacrificing the ability for each nation or some of the key nations to have their flag on the tail of the airline, it's still possible. What is important is commercial arrangements and constructs that we pull together, leveraging the open skies policy that the continent has adopted. This is why it's important to partner deeply to share the benefits. So, for example, taking regional airlines in the West Africa, working with long-haul kind of airlines like SAA, whether it's Ethiopian Airlines or Kenya Airways. So finding the right point of partnership, that's what is going to sustain the new agreement. The moment it's seen to be a few players that are benefiting out of the open skies, I think that's where the thing is going to break again. So we have to, commercially, we must keep it in play by making sure that we partner deeply with the regional and domestic airline, build consortia, even if it's just commercial JVs, even if you don't even get to the M&A part. So we have to walk the journey, build trust, and making sure that we address the opportunity that is in the continent to move Africans within their continent.
Let me just bring in Lawrence on this particular one. Lawrence, just kindly comment on the mergers bit. We're seeing so many airlines propping up. And also the issue on the taxes. We're seeing that the cost of fares is just utterly immense. Many of them are saying that actually the taxes what we are paying on arrival and departure are astronomical.
Well, that's one of the issues that's being dealt with, or that has been dealt with by the liberalization of the market. One of the issues, for example, on the question of tariffs and charges, whereby just by a declaration, airlines can fix their fares. But the problem, of course, is that a significant proportion of a ticket price paid for by a passenger, as you say, goes into non-aeronautical tariffs. So you have your passenger service charge, you have fuel surcharges, you have all sorts of other charges. Now, that clearly can create market distortions. And you're getting to a stage where, for example, in Nigeria, the revenue accruing to an airline is about 60% of what you see on the ticket. Now, that can be a disincentive. But I agree with Mr. Vuyani that every airline, every state has to look for commercial agreements and arrangements that suit them the best. What you tend to see in aviation is everybody trying to reinvent the wheel and everybody trying to do everything. Yes, I mean, connectivity is very important. Everybody doesn't have to buy the same size of aircraft. Everybody doesn't have to have the same model. There are many parts of Nigeria, for example, that will benefit from turboprop connectivity. You do not need a big, medium-sized Boeing to carry 80 passengers to some of the remote areas of the country. So I agree with him entirely that every country, well, start from the micro level, every airline, then every country has to first of all decide what's in its own best interest. And so liberalization and harmonization cannot be a one-size-fits-all. And if already you have successful large carriers like ET or Kenya or SAA that can provide international connectivity, and you now have fifth freedom rights. Clearly, if you bring everybody from within your hinterlands to certain airports that are hubs or regional hubs. The large international or the established international carriers, regional or African carriers, can do the rest. So I agree that commercial arrangements that will give you predictable outcomes are probably the way to go. On the global scale, you've seen the proliferation of alliances. So whether it is the Star Alliance, which SAA belongs to, or what's it called, the KLM one, or the British Airways one, you have various alliances, and connectivity and seamless travel is one of the benefits of such alliances. And I think African carriers have to try their best to meet the same standards, the same safety and security standards that will enable them to participate fully in such alliances.
Some pertinent points there. Gentlemen, I'm afraid that's all the time that we did have today. So without a doubt, I would love to actually keep you here and just take this on some more. But I'm afraid that's all that we did have time for. We do look forward to seeing you again, 6:30 Central African time every Monday and Wednesday, more Capital Connection. But for now, have a good evening.